My sister destroyed all my relationships until she met the one man she couldn't manipulate, and that's when the worst began. I was 23 when I brought my first serious boyfriend home for Christmas. We'd been dating for 8 months, and I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. He worked at an accounting firm, had this steady, reliable quality that made me feel safe, the kind of guy my parents always said they wanted for me. Looking back, I should have known better. The drive to my parents' house took 45 minutes. I spent most of it coaching him on my family, warning him about my dad's interrogations and my mom's invasive questions. I didn't mention my sister. Didn't know how to explain something I barely understood myself. We arrived at 6:30, and the house was already full of relatives. The smell of ham and cinnamon filled every room, Christmas music played, and I felt that familiar mix of nostalgia and dread. My mom ushered us into the chaos. I introduced him to probably 15 people in the first 10 minutes. Then my sister came down the stairs in this tight red dress that left nothing to the imagination. She saw us and her face lit up with that performative smile. She hugged him first, not me. Held on too long, pulling back slowly with her hand on his shoulder. Then she hugged me like an afterthought, already turning back to him with breathless questions. The entire evening was a nightmare. Every time we sat down, she'd find a way to sit between us. When he went to help my dad, she'd volunteer too. She laughed too loud at his jokes, found excuses to show him things in different rooms. My family thought it was hilarious. My aunt kept saying how charming she was. My dad said she'd inherited all the charisma in the family, looking at me when he said it. I sat there feeling my stomach twist, trying to convince myself I was paranoid. On the drive home, he was quiet. I asked if he was okay. He said yes, just a little overwhelming, then added that my sister was very friendly. The way he said it made my skin crawl. 2 months later, he broke up with me. Said he needed space, things felt different, he wasn't sure what he wanted. Standard breakup lines. I asked if there was someone else. He said no. I didn't believe him. 1 week later, my cousin tagged me in a social media story. There they were, my ex and my sister at some trendy bar downtown, her hand on his chest, both laughing. I stared until the story disappeared, feeling like someone had punched all the air out of my lungs. When I confronted my sister, she acted like I was insane. Said they'd just run into each other, it was innocent, I was being dramatic. My mom told me to let it go, that men don't like jealous women. My sister didn't even try to hide it after that. They dated for 3 months. At 25, I tried again with someone I'd been seeing for 2 years. He knew about what happened before, promised he saw through that kind of manipulation. We went to my parents' anniversary party. My sister showed up in another red dress, and I watched it all play out again. This time I confronted everyone. They called me insecure, paranoid. My grandmother looked me in the eye and said if I was more feminine, more attentive, I'd be able to keep a man interested, like it was my fault. That relationship ended 3 weeks later. Same excuses. I saw them together at a wedding 2 months after that. By 26, it happened a third time. That's when I finally understood. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. I stopped bringing anyone home. For the next 3 years, I dated in secret, telling my family I was focused on my career. When I turned 29, my cousin called with a proposition. She worked at a literacy program for incarcerated people and desperately needed volunteers. Honestly, I almost said no, but I had nothing else going on that Friday night. The program coordinator explained everything over coffee in a church basement. We'd correspond with inmates who wanted to improve their reading and writing skills, help them prepare for GED exams. All male went through the program. We could stop anytime. They gave me 6 names to choose from. I picked 3. 2 sent back generic responses, but the third wrote this 3-page letter, full of crossed-out words and mistakes, but completely honest. He was serving time for armed robbery. 19 years old, owed a dealer money, walked into a bakery at 3 a.m. with a fake gun, took $873, got arrested 2 hours later. 8-year sentence, had served 7. He didn't make excuses. Wrote about the shame, his grandmother crying at sentencing, his sister stopping visits. About wanting to get his contractor's license when he got out. The letter was raw and real in a way that made me want to respond. We started off with grammar corrections and vocabulary building, which was ostensibly the point of the program. I'd mark his errors gently, explain the rules, give him exercises to practice. He'd write back with improved versions, with questions about things he didn't understand, with a dedication to learning that I found admirable. But somewhere around the fourth or fifth letter, it shifted into something more. He asked me how my week was, and I actually told him. Not the sanitized version I gave my coworkers or my family, but the truth. Told him about my boss who micromanaged everything and took credit for my ideas, about my apartment with the leaking ceiling that my landlord refused to fix, about the strange limbo of being almost 30 and feeling like I'd somehow missed the boat on having a real life, about feeling stuck in a job that paid the bills but slowly drained my soul, in a city where I had acquaintances but no real friends, in a life that looked fine from the outside but felt empty and lonely on the inside. He wrote back with this brutal honesty that most people don't have. No toxic positivity telling me everything happens for a reason. No empty reassurances that things would magically get better. No comparing his situation to mine in some weird oppression Olympics way. Just real observations about real problems. About the trap of settling for good enough. About how being comfortable can be its own kind of prison. He wrote about how he'd had all the time in the world to think about his choices. About how he'd realized that everyone builds their own cage in some way, just some of them have actual bars. Around the eighth letter, I made a vague reference to family issues. Nothing specific, just mentioned that the upcoming holidays were complicated, that I was dreading Thanksgiving and Christmas. His response came back 2 weeks later, and tucked in between grammar exercises and vocabulary practice was this paragraph that stopped me cold. Sounds like your sister is the kind of person who only feels good about herself when she's making other people feel bad. That's not about you. That's about how empty she is inside. People like that are black holes. They take, and it's never enough because they're trying to fill something that can't be filled from the outside. I read that paragraph probably 20 times that night, sitting on my couch with tears running down my face. Something about the simplicity of it, the directness, the lack of any attempt to soften the truth, just hit me in a way that years of therapy and self-help books and well-meaning friends never had. This guy who'd made terrible choices and paid a heavy price for them, who was living in a cell and probably would be for another few months, he saw through everything so clearly. No sugarcoating, no trying to make me see my sister's perspective, no telling me family is everything and I needed to forgive and forget. Just the simple, stark truth that some people are toxic and you're allowed to protect yourself from them. I wrote back with more details. Still vague enough to maintain appropriate boundaries, but honest about the pattern, about the 3 relationships, about the family that enabled it, about feeling like I was crazy for seeing what was happening when everyone around me acted like I was the problem. He responded with something I'd needed to hear for years. You're not crazy. Your normal meter is broken because your family broke it, but the fact that you can see the pattern means you're healing. The hard part is deciding what to do about it. We wrote back and forth for 8 months total. The letters got longer, more personal, deeper. He told me about prison life in careful terms that didn't glorify or dramatize it, just the reality of living in a concrete box with someone else's schedule dictating every moment of your day. About learning to meditate because it was the only way to find quiet in a place that's never actually silent. About the friends he'd made. The men who were actually trying to change versus the ones who were just counting days. About his grandmother's visits. How she'd forgiven him faster than he'd forgiven himself. About his plans for when he got out. The apartment he'd found through a reentry program. The construction company that hired ex-offenders. I told him about my life in similar detail. About the promotion I got that came with more responsibility but barely more money. About finally getting the ceiling fixed after threatening to call the housing authority. About the small victories and the persistent loneliness, about the men I dated casually while keeping them far away from my family. About the relief of not having my heart broken, but also the sadness of never letting anyone close enough to matter. He was released in February on a Tuesday morning. I know because he'd written me a letter 3 weeks earlier with the exact date, asking if I wanted to meet once he got settled. I'd said yes immediately. Then spent those 3 weeks alternating between excitement and terror. What if the connection we had on paper didn't translate to real life? What if he looked at me and was disappointed? What if I'd built him up in my head into someone he wasn't? We agreed to meet 2 weeks after his release at this small coffee shop near the bus station called Something Generic. Neutral territory where neither of us would feel trapped if things were awkward or disappointing. I got there 15 minutes early because I'm anxious like that. Ordered a coffee I was too nervous to drink, and sat at a table near the window where I could watch the door. Every time it opened, my heart jumped. And then it would be someone else, and I'd feel this confusing mix of relief and disappointment. When he finally walked in at exactly the time we'd agreed on, I recognized him immediately. even though his photo from 7 years ago was outdated. He looked older, obviously, but not in a bad way. Prison ages you differently than normal life does. There was a wariness in the way he moved, in the way his eyes scanned the room before landing on me, in the careful way he approached the table. But when he smiled, it was the same warmth I'd felt in his letters, and something in my chest loosened. We sat down, and for the first 10 minutes, it was stilted in that particular way first meetings always are when you already know each other on paper, but not in person. The rhythm of conversation felt off, like we were both trying too hard. He asked about my drive there. I asked if he'd had trouble finding the place. We both commented on the weather like strangers making small talk. I started to panic, thinking I'd made a mistake, that we should have kept it to letters where we both knew how to communicate. Then he made some joke about the coffee shop's pretentious menu, how they had 15 different milk alternatives but couldn't figure out how to make a regular cup of coffee that didn't taste like dirty water. I laughed, actually laughed, and suddenly we were just talking. 3 hours went by in what felt like minutes. We covered everything and nothing, the big things and the small things, the serious conversations and the stupid ones. He told me about his first week out, how disorienting it was to have choices again, how he'd stood in a grocery store for 20 minutes, just staring at the shampoo options because he hadn't had to make a decision like that in 7 years. I told him about the promotion meeting I'd had that morning, how my boss had somehow made my success about him, how I'd smiled and nodded while internally screaming. The barista started giving us pointed looks around hour 3, wiping down tables unnecessarily close to us, straightening chairs that didn't need straightening. We finally took the hint, gathered our things, walked outside into the cold afternoon. The sun was setting early like it does in February, and we stood there on the sidewalk, neither of us quite ready to leave yet. He asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime, maybe next week. I said yes before he even finished the question. We exchanged phone numbers, actual phone numbers now that the program didn't have to mediate, and he gave me this look like he couldn't quite believe this was real. I knew the feeling. I'd spent the last 3 years convinced I was fundamentally unlovable, fundamentally flawed, and here was someone who'd spent 7 years in prison looking at me like I was something precious. The next months were different from anything I'd experienced before. We took things slow, both of us carrying our own baggage, both of us careful not to rush into anything. He worked in construction, started at 6 in the morning, and came home physically exhausted most nights. Lived with his grandmother in a small apartment across town to help with rent and keep her company. Was taking night classes twice a week to get his contractor's license. Studying at the kitchen table after dinner, while his grandmother watched her shows in the living room. He had this maturity that none of the supposedly successful guys I'd dated ever had. Maybe prison does that to you, forces you to grow up fast or get eaten alive. Maybe it was just who he was fundamentally. But he listened when I talked. Actually listened instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He didn't play games or send mixed signals or do that thing where men act interested then suddenly ghost you for no reason. When he said he'd call, he called. When he said he wanted to see me again, he meant it. When he said he was working late, he was actually working late, not out with friends or seeing other women or any of the paranoid scenarios my broken brain tried to create. We'd meet for dinner when he didn't have class, usually cheap places because neither of us had much money. Diners with sticky menus and refillable coffee. Food trucks parked near the construction sites where he worked. His grandmother's kitchen table where she'd make us dinner and then excuse herself to give us privacy, while not so subtly leaving the bedroom door open because she was old-fashioned like that. He met my middle sister in April, the one who stayed out of drama. We ran into her at the supermarket by accident, and she was nice enough, polite, asked normal questions, made normal conversation. She texted me later saying he seemed really good for me, that she could tell he cared about me by the way he looked at me. It was such a simple observation, but it made me cry because I realized how long it had been since anyone in my family said something supportive about my relationship choices instead of critical or mocking or dismissive. By the time October rolled around, we were solid, comfortable in that good way where you don't have to perform or pretend. Real in a way that let us be fully ourselves, flaws and baggage and all. I'd met his friends from the construction crew, gone to his grandmother's birthday dinner, helped him study for his licensing exam. He'd met my coworkers at a happy hour, fixed the perpetually broken cabinet in my kitchen, started keeping a toothbrush at my apartment. Then November happened, and everything changed. My mom called on a Thursday evening, didn't bother with pleasantries, just launched straight into her demands. I needed to come home for Christmas. Not asking, not requesting, demanding in that particular tone she uses, that means she's already told the whole family I'm coming, and I'll embarrass her if I don't show up. She'd already set up the guest room, already told everyone I'd be there, already planned the seating arrangement around my attendance. How could I do this to her? Make her look like a liar in front of the family, ruin Christmas before it even started? I felt that old panic rising in my chest. That same panic I'd felt every holiday season for the past 3 years. My hands started shaking, my breathing got short, and I had to sit down on the floor because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. He found me there 20 minutes later when he got off work, sitting on the kitchen floor with my phone in my hand, staring at nothing. He sat down next to me without asking questions, just sat there until I was ready to talk. Then I told him everything. Every humiliating detail I'd been holding back, trying to seem less damaged than I was. The pattern, the manipulation, the 3 relationships destroyed by my sister's need for validation, the family that watched it happen with amusement instead of horror, the grandmother who told me I wasn't feminine enough to keep a man interested, the years I'd spent hiding, dating in secret, protecting myself by never letting anyone close enough to matter, the way my family made me feel crazy for seeing what was happening right in front of everyone. I expected him to make excuses, to back out gracefully, to suddenly remember he had other plans for Christmas. Who wants to sign up for that kind of family drama? Who wants to walk willingly into that dysfunction? But instead, he said he wanted to come with me, wanted to meet them, wanted to be there, wanted to support me through it. I actually laughed, this bitter, broken sound that didn't feel like my own laugh. Told him we'd been together for 9 months, that things were good between us, that he didn't understand what my sister was like, what she was capable of, how she'd systematically destroyed every relationship I'd tried to build. Told him she was beautiful and charming and knew exactly what she was doing. Told him men always think they're different, that they'll be the exception, that they won't fall for it, and they're always wrong. He looked at me with this completely calm expression, this certainty that should have scared me but somehow didn't. Said he'd spent 7 years in prison, shared a cell with men who'd done terrible things, survived in an environment designed to break you, learned to see through manipulation because his life depended on it. My family couldn't be worse than that. My sister couldn't be scarier than the things he'd already survived. I wanted to believe him. Wanted to so badly it physically hurt. But I also knew he had no idea what he was walking into. My sister didn't just flirt. She hunted. She made it her mission to prove she could take whatever she wanted, and she'd never failed before. Every man who'd promised to be different, who'd sworn he wouldn't fall for it, who'd looked me in the eye and said he chose me, they'd all ended up the same way. Why would he be any different? But he insisted, and honestly, I was tired of hiding. Tired of letting her win before the fight even started. Tired of protecting myself by never letting myself have anything worth protecting. So I said yes. Called my mom back, told her I'd be there and I was bringing someone. She sounded surprised but pleased, probably already imagining the wedding she'd get to plan, the grandchildren she'd get to show off. I didn't correct her assumptions. Didn't tell her I'd be happy if we just survived Christmas without bloodshed or another destroyed relationship. The weeks leading up to Christmas were tense. I kept having these panic attacks where I couldn't breathe, where my mind would spiral into all the worst-case scenarios. He'd hold me through them, let me cry or rage or sit in silence. Never made me feel weak or crazy for being terrified of my own family. He'd been through worse, but he never made me feel like my pain was less valid because his had been more extreme. Just sat with me in it until I could breathe again. We decided to drive up Christmas Day itself, spend the minimum amount of time required, leave as soon as politely possible. I packed a bag with outfit changes like I was preparing for battle, which, in a way, I was. Tried on 6 different things before settling on something that made me feel confident, but not like I was trying too hard. He wore a button-down shirt his grandmother had ironed for him, nice jeans without any tears or paint stains from work, and the watch his mother had given him before she passed when he was 16. We looked like a normal couple going to a normal family Christmas, if only. We arrived at my parents' house at exactly 7 in the evening on Christmas, right on time like my mother demanded. The street was already lined with cars from relatives who'd gotten there early, and I could hear Christmas music and laughter coming from inside before we even reached the door. The smell of ham and cinnamon and pine hit us the moment we walked in, that particular combination that used to mean comfort and family but had come to mean anxiety and dread for me over the past few years. My mom hugged me first. One of those quick, performative hugs that's more about appearance than affection. Then she turned to him with actual warmth, thanking him for coming, saying she'd heard so much about him, ushering us both inside like she was genuinely happy we were there. My dad shook his hand, asked him about work, made small talk about construction and the housing market. My aunts and uncles waved from the living room where they were already drinking and watching a game on the television. Everything seemed normal. Almost. Then my sister came down the stairs. She was wearing another red dress because of course she was. This one was even more dramatic than the ones I remembered, tighter and shorter and cut in a way that was completely inappropriate for a family Christmas, but that she'd somehow get away with, because she always did. Her hair was perfectly styled, falling over one shoulder in loose waves, and she was wearing those impossibly high heels that made her look like she'd just stepped off a runway instead of down the stairs of our childhood home. The entire room went quiet for a moment, like we were all actors in a play and she was the star making her grand entrance. She saw us and her face lit up with that smile I'd seen 100 times before, the one that looked genuine and warm, but that I knew was calculated down to the last detail. She walked straight over to us, and I braced myself for what was coming. She hugged him first, of course, not me, him. Wrapped her arms around him in this full-body hug that lasted way too long, pressing herself against him, pulling back slowly with her hands lingering on his shoulders. Then she hugged me like an afterthought, barely a one-armed squeeze before she turned back to him with questions and compliments, and that breathless, interested voice she used when she was performing. What was his name again? Oh, that's such a strong name. What kind of construction did he do? That must be so interesting, and so physically demanding. She couldn't imagine doing that kind of work. How impressive. Had he always lived in our state? Oh, he'd moved around. How adventurous. She'd always wanted to travel more, but never seemed to find the time. Each question delivered with this constant touching of his arm, this leaning in close, this way of making him the only person in the room. My stomach dropped immediately. It was starting. The same pattern I'd watched play out 3 times before. The same predatory focus I'd hoped maybe, just maybe, wouldn't happen this time. My family was already watching with those same amused expressions, my aunt nudging my uncle, my cousin smirking from the couch. They thought it was entertaining. They thought my sister's behavior was charming instead of cruel, thought my discomfort was insecurity instead of justified fear. Dinner was a nightmare. My mom had set up the table with assigned seating, which should have meant we'd sit together. But somehow my sister ended up between us, claiming someone had moved the place cards around and it was too much trouble to fix now. She spent the entire meal monopolizing the conversation, asking him questions about his life, his work, his interests, barely letting anyone else get a word in. Every time I tried to redirect the conversation or include other people, she'd find a way to steer it back to him, to make herself the center of his attention. She asked about his family, his childhood, his plans for the future. When he mentioned his grandmother, she lit up and said how sweet it was that he lived with her, how family is so important, how she wished more men valued their relationships with their grandmothers the way he clearly did. When he mentioned the night classes, she practically glowed, saying how ambitious he was, how impressive it was that he was working and studying at the same time, how most men she knew didn't have that kind of drive. Every compliment delivered with a touch on his arm, a lean in his direction, a look that suggested intimacy that didn't exist. After dinner, everyone moved to the living room for drinks and dessert. I tried to sit next to him on the couch, but my sister somehow managed to wedge herself between us again, this time with an excuse about wanting to hear more about his construction work because she was thinking about doing some renovations on her apartment and wanted his professional opinion. She sat so close to him their legs were almost touching, turned her entire body toward him, created this bubble of attention that excluded everyone else. He was polite but firm, which I noticed even through my panic. He answered her questions with short responses, 1 or 2 words when possible, and kept redirecting the conversation back to include me or other people. When she'd lean in close, he'd lean back slightly, creating distance without being overtly rude. When she'd touch his arm, he'd move to pick up his drink or adjust his position, breaking the contact naturally. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was deliberate, and I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Around 9, my uncle suggested showing him the garage where my dad kept his old car collection, and several of the men headed outside. My sister immediately volunteered to come along, saying she loved old cars even though I'd never heard her express any interest in them before. I started to follow, but my mom caught my arm and asked me to help her in the kitchen with something that absolutely could have waited. By the time I got outside 10 minutes later, they were all coming back in, and my sister looked frustrated in a way I recognized. My younger brother pulled me aside while everyone was getting more drinks. He looked uncomfortable, kept glancing at our sister like he was worried she'd hear him. Then he told me what happened in the garage. While my dad and uncles were showing off the cars and talking about engines and restoration work, my sister had cornered him near the tool bench, asked if he wanted her number, said they should meet up sometime for coffee or drinks, that she knew great places around town. He'd shut her down immediately, told her he wasn't interested, that he was with me, and that wasn't going to change. She'd tried to play it off as a joke, said she was just being friendly, but my brother had heard the whole thing and knew better. I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been closed tight for years. He'd actually said no. Actively. Deliberately said no, when it would have been easier not to. When she was offering herself to him with no complications, no history, no baggage except the baggage he didn't know about yet, he chose me. The rest of the evening was tense. My sister tried a few more times, each attempt more desperate than the last. She spilled wine on her dress and asked him specifically to help her clean it up, saying something about how construction workers must be good with their hands. He politely declined and suggested she ask my mom. She asked him to reach something from a high shelf, even though my dad was standing right there. He got it, but handed it to my dad to give to her. She tried to get him alone by asking him to help carry something to her car, and he said he'd get my uncle to help instead. Every single time he found a way to refuse without being rude, without making a scene, but with absolute firmness. By 11, we said our goodbyes. My mom hugged us both, told us to drive safely, said she hoped we'd visit again soon. My dad shook his hand again, said it was good to meet him. My sister gave us both tight, brittle hugs, and I could feel the anger radiating off her, even though she was still smiling. My younger brother caught my eye and gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had happened, what it meant. The drive home was mostly silent. I kept crying, these weird, almost hysterical tears that I couldn't explain. He kept one hand on my leg, drove carefully through the dark streets. Didn't push me to talk. When we got back to my apartment, I finally found words. Told him he had no idea what tonight meant, how every other man had fallen for it, how I'd been waiting all night for him to follow her somewhere or exchange numbers or give her even the smallest indication that he was interested, how I'd been bracing myself for the inevitable betrayal that never came. He pulled me close and said something I'll never forget. He said he'd seen men in prison who'd sabotaged their own freedom just for a moment of feeling powerful or desired or in control. Men who'd throw away years of good behavior, who'd risk everything they'd worked for just for some temporary validation. He'd learned early that some offers aren't really offers, they're tests. And he'd learned the difference between someone who wants you and someone who wants to win. My sister didn't want him. She just wanted to prove she could take him from me. And he wasn't interested in being anyone's trophy or tool for sibling rivalry. I cried harder, but this time it was relief. For the first time in my entire life, someone had actively, deliberately, repeatedly chosen me when there was a shinier option right there, practically throwing herself at him. Someone had seen through the manipulation that my entire family pretended wasn't happening. Someone had protected me and us and the relationship we'd built together, even though it would have been easier not to. Even though saying yes would have cost him nothing in the immediate moment. I fell asleep in his arms that night, feeling something I hadn't felt since I was 22 years old. Safe. 1 week later, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work trying to focus on a project deadline, my mom called. I almost didn't answer because I was in a meeting, but something made me step out and take it. She was furious in a way I'd rarely heard before, practically screaming at me before I could even say hello properly. Did I know what I'd done? Did I have any idea how upset my sister was? How could I be so selfish, so thoughtless, so deliberately cruel? I had no idea what she was talking about. Stood there in the hallway outside the conference room, trying to understand what I'd supposedly done wrong this time. Then she explained. My sister had done some research, some digging, had found out about his criminal record, the armed robbery, the 7 years in prison, and she'd told the entire family, crying while she did it, saying she'd felt threatened during Christmas, that he'd been aggressive and inappropriate, that she'd tried to be nice and welcoming and he'd made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't even articulate. My blood went cold. I tried to explain what actually happened, how my sister had pursued him relentlessly, how she'd offered him her number, how he'd rejected her repeatedly. My mom cut me off, said I was being ridiculous, that my sister had no reason to lie. Why would she make something like that up? And even if some of what I was saying was true, I should have told the family beforehand that I was bringing a criminal to a family gathering, that people had a right to know, to decide if they felt safe, that I'd put everyone at risk with my secrecy. My phone started exploding while I was still on the call with my mom, text messages coming in faster than I could read them, my aunt saying I was selfish and irresponsible, asking how I could endanger the whole family like that. What was I thinking? My uncle saying I should have warned everyone, that he had young children there, that he would have brought his family if he'd known there was a violent criminal in the house. Another aunt sending a long message about family trust and betrayal, about how disappointed she was in me, how I'd changed and not for the better. My grandmother, who I'd always thought had at least some affection for me despite her earlier cruelty, sent me a 5-minute voice message. I listened to it in my car after leaving work early, unable to handle being around people anymore. She went on and on about how I was destroying the family's reputation, how people would talk, how she'd have to explain to her friends from church why her granddaughter was dating an ex-convict, about how I was putting everyone in danger, how I clearly had no judgment, how I must have some kind of savior complex, or be desperate for attention to date someone like that. The contempt in her voice was worse than the words themselves. The only person who didn't pile on was my younger brother. He sent me a simple text message that night. She's full of it. He was perfectly nice to everyone. She's just mad he rejected her. Then another one right after. I'll tell anyone who asks what really happened in the garage. You're not alone. I called him immediately, crying so hard I could barely speak. He told me to hang on, that he'd seen this pattern before with our sister, that he was done staying quiet. He said he'd already tried to tell our parents the truth about what happened in the garage, about how she'd cornered him and offered her number and gotten rejected. They'd brushed him off, said he misunderstood, that he was taking my side because he always did, but he wasn't backing down this time. He was going to keep telling the truth whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. 3 weeks of tense, angry silence followed. I blocked half my family on social media because I couldn't handle seeing their posts about family values and trust and loyalty, knowing they were directed at me. Stopped answering calls from anyone except my younger brother and my middle sister, who'd stayed conspicuously quiet through all of it. Started having panic attacks again. The kind where I couldn't breathe, where the walls felt like they were closing in. He'd hold me through them, remind me to breathe, tell me we'd get through this together. We talked about what to do. Part of me wanted to just cut them all off, move on, build a life that didn't include any of them. But another part of me worried about what my sister might do next. She'd never been rejected like this before, never had someone see through her manipulation and refuse to play along, and she'd always been vindictive when she didn't get what she wanted, even as a kid. This felt different, though. More dangerous. Then, about 3.5 weeks after Christmas, my middle sister called. Asked if we could meet for coffee, said it was urgent, that we needed to talk in person, and she couldn't discuss it over the phone. Her voice sounded strange, stressed in a way I'd never heard before. I almost said no, almost told her I was done with all of them, that I didn't have the energy for more family drama. But something in her tone made me agree. We met at a cafe near her apartment the next afternoon. She looked terrible when she walked in, like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing sweatpants and an old sweater instead of her usual put-together outfits. She kept fidgeting with her coffee cup after she ordered, picking at the cardboard sleeve, not making eye contact, clearly working up the courage to say whatever she'd asked me here to say. Finally, after probably 10 minutes of painful small talk, she just blurted it out. Our older sister was obsessed, full-on stalking his social media, screenshotting old posts from years ago, combing through everything trying to find ammunition. She'd been spending hours every day going through his profiles, his friends' profiles, looking for anything she could use. And worse, much worse, she was planning to file a false police report claiming he'd threatened her during Christmas, that he'd cornered her in the garage and made aggressive comments about knowing where she lived, what kind of car she drove, that she'd felt physically threatened, and had been too scared to say anything at the time. My blood went cold. I felt like I was going to throw up right there in the cafe. I asked my middle sister why she was telling me this, what she wanted from me, what she expected me to do with this information. Was she part of this too? Was this some kind of sick game they were playing together? She looked up then, and her eyes were wet with unshed tears. Said she'd been in our older sister's apartment 2 nights ago, had seen all the screenshots spread out on her dining room table, had heard her on the phone with someone discussing the details of the false report. She'd confronted her, asked her what the hell she was doing, tried to make her see how wrong this was. Our older sister had blown up at her, said I deserved it for bringing a criminal into the family, that she was doing everyone a favor, that someone needed to protect the family since clearly no one else would. My middle sister said she couldn't let it happen. Couldn't let our older sister destroy someone's life just because her ego was bruised. That she'd stayed quiet too many times before, watched too many cruel things happen without speaking up, convinced herself it wasn't her business or wasn't that serious. But this was too far. This could send him back to prison. This was potentially ruining an innocent person's life out of pure spite. She couldn't be part of that, couldn't stay silent about that, even if it meant going against family. I asked if she'd testify if it came to that, if she'd tell the truth about what really happened, what our sister was planning. She said yes, absolutely, without hesitation. But she also said she couldn't confront our older sister directly again, that she was genuinely scared of her, of what she might do. Our older sister had always had this ability to make people around her suffer when she didn't get her way. And my middle sister had been on the receiving end of that enough times to be terrified of it happening again. I left that coffee shop shaking, got in my car, and sat there for probably 20 minutes before I could drive. Kept thinking about how my sister was willing to lie to the police, to potentially send him back to prison, to destroy his entire life and future, all because he'd rejected her advances. How far gone did you have to be to think that was acceptable? How broken inside? I drove straight to his construction site, waited until his lunch break, pulled him aside, and told him everything. He went very still, very quiet, in that way he did when he was processing something serious. Then he asked me what I wanted to do. Not what he wanted, what I wanted. Whether I wanted to stay and fight this, or whether I wanted to just cut ties and run, start over somewhere else. He said he'd support whatever I decided, that this was my family and my choice. I wanted to run. God, I wanted to pack up everything and move to another state, change our numbers, never speak to any of them again. But I also knew running wouldn't solve anything. My sister would find us if she really wanted to. And more than that, I was tired of running, of hiding, of letting her win by default. So we decided to stay and fight. We contacted a lawyer that week, explained the situation. The lawyer said that filing a false police report is a crime in itself, that if it came to that, we'd have witnesses and evidence on our side. My younger brother volunteered to testify about what he'd heard in the kitchen. My middle sister said she'd provide a statement if needed. But even with all that, I was terrified. A false accusation could violate his parole, send him back to prison even if it was eventually proven false. The system doesn't always wait for the truth before dealing out punishment. We spent 2 weeks in this awful limbo, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the police to show up at his door. Then my sister got into a car accident. Nothing major, she backed into her own garage door and crumpled her rear bumper, but she ended up in the emergency room for a panic attack afterward. She called me from the hospital, crying hysterically, begging me to come. I debated it. Part of me wanted to tell her to figure it out herself, that I was done being her emotional support after everything she'd put me through. But another part of me, the part that remembered when we were kids and actually liked each other, made me go. She looked destroyed. Not physically injured, but emotionally wrecked in a way I'd never seen before. Between sobs, she told me what happened. She'd mentioned her plan to her therapist during their session, probably looking for validation or strategy. Instead, her therapist had drawn a hard line. Told her that if she filed a false report, their therapeutic relationship was over. That she couldn't and wouldn't be party to criminal behavior. That she'd have to report it herself if my sister went through with it. It was apparently the first time in my sister's life that someone had given her a real, non-negotiable boundary. Not a soft suggestion or a gentle redirection, but a hard stop. And it broke something open in her. She said she couldn't do it, couldn't file the false report, that her therapist had made her see how monumentally wrong it was. The panic attack, the accident, it all came from finally facing what she'd almost done. She started talking, really talking, about years of insecurity, about using men for validation, about how seeing me lose while she won was the only thing that made her feel valuable, about how empty she felt inside, how the attention from men was the only time she felt real. She'd been in therapy for 6 months at that point, working through childhood stuff, but this was the first time she'd admitted any of it out loud to me. I didn't offer forgiveness, didn't tell her it was okay or that we'd work through it. I just said I needed her to leave us alone. No contact with me, no contact with him, no more drama. She nodded, still crying, and I left. 2 weeks after the hospital, we were on my couch watching some mindless show when he paused it suddenly, turned to me with this serious expression and said he wanted to marry me. Not right now, but eventually. When you know, he said. Simple as that. I started crying. The good kind of crying this time. We got married 3 months later at a small farm owned by his uncle. 15 people total. His brother was the best man. His grandmother cried through the entire ceremony. My mom called the day before, crying and saying I was making a mistake. My dad sent a text saying I'd regret this. Neither of them came. 6 months after the wedding, a letter arrived. 10 pages, handwritten, from my older sister. She detailed her therapy journey, the work she was doing to understand why she did what she did. How she'd realized she used male attention to avoid dealing with her own emptiness. How watching me fail made her feel temporarily successful in a life where she felt like she had no real accomplishments. How she'd built her entire identity around being desired, and when that didn't work on him, it shattered something fundamental. She didn't ask for forgiveness in the letter, just said she wanted me to understand. I read it twice, then wrote back a short response acknowledging her courage but reaffirming that I needed distance. That maybe someday we could rebuild something, but not now. Possibly not ever. 1.5 years passed. My middle sister called out of nowhere and said our older sister was different. Really different. 2 years of intensive therapy, had cut out toxic friends, was single for the first time since high school and actually working on herself. She'd asked about inviting me to lunch multiple times but was too nervous to reach out directly. We talked on the phone for 2 hours. She told me about her therapy breakthroughs, about finally understanding that she'd been using men as a measure of worth because she didn't have any internal sense of value. About how terrifying it was to be alone with herself for the first time. I told her about our life, the small apartment we'd rented, the dog we'd adopted, the stupid arguments about whether to get a cat. At the end of the conversation, I agreed to lunch. Just lunch, nothing more. No promises, no expectations. I don't know if she's really changed or if this is just another phase. Don't know if I'll ever fully forgive her for what she put me through, for the years I spent hiding and the self-doubt she planted that still creeps up sometimes. But here's what I do know. I'm not obsessed with getting my family's approval anymore. I'm not competing with anyone or measuring my worth by whether I can keep a man interested. I have a partner who chose me when it actually mattered, when the easier path was right there in a red dress. We have a home we built together, a life that belongs to us, plans that don't involve anyone's permission or validation. My younger brother came to visit last month, stayed for a weekend, said it was the most relaxed he'd ever seen me. We took him to our favorite breakfast place, the one where they know our order by heart. Walked the dog through the park, watched a game at a sports bar, had the kind of easy family time I'd forgotten could exist. On his last day, he said something that stuck with me. He said he used to think all families were supposed to be complicated, that drama was just part of the package. But watching us, seeing how simple and peaceful our life was, made him realize that wasn't true. That sometimes the family you choose is healthier than the family you're born into. I think about that a lot now. About how I spent so many years trying to fix something that was fundamentally broken, trying to earn love from people who saw me as competition or collateral damage. About how much energy I wasted on relationships that were always going to hurt me. My middle sister asked me last week if I thought our older sister deserved a second chance. I told her I didn't know yet. That forgiveness isn't something you can force or rush. That I needed to protect my peace first. And if there's room for reconciliation later, it'll happen naturally. Or it won't. And that's okay too. I'm learning that you don't owe anyone your suffering. You don't owe toxic people your presence just because you share DNA. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away and build something new. I have a partner who chose me when it mattered, when the easier path was right there. I have a home that feels safe, mornings without anxiety, nights where I sleep without replaying what I did wrong. A life built on my terms, with someone who proves every day that I was always enough. The lunch with my older sister is scheduled for next month. I might go, I might cancel, but either way, it won't define me. I've spent too many years letting her have that power. My husband asked me yesterday what I wanted for dinner, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had an anxiety attack. The constant vigilance I used to carry has slowly dissolved. This is what peace feels like. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of someone who faces them with you instead of creating them. My grandmother sent me a message last week. First contact in almost 3 years. She apologized for what she'd said that day. About me not being feminine enough. I haven't responded yet. Some apologies come too late. But I appreciate that my older sister's changes are rippling out, making others examine their own behavior. The dog just brought me his leash. My husband is finishing a work call and we're meeting my middle sister for dinner later. Normal, boring, beautiful life. The kind I never thought I'd have. After everything, this quiet, chosen life is everything I needed. It's healing in ways I didn't know I needed to heal. It's teaching me that I don't have to perform or prove myself into being worthy of love. I was always worthy. I just needed to find someone who already knew that, and then choose myself too. So that's where I am now. Living with a man who went to prison and came out better than most. Walking my dog, having ordinary dinners with family members who showed up when it mattered, considering lunch with a sister who might have changed. It's not a fairy tale ending, fairy tale. It's messier, more uncertain, but it's mine. Built on honesty and the kind of love that doesn't require me to be anyone other than who I am. And you know what? That's more than enough. It's everything.